And welcome back. We are now going to go ahead and start by putting some trees in here. Now we do have some green effect here to these kind of mid-ground mountains, but we want to add just a little bit more. So I'm just going to go ahead and hide my foreground layer here just to get started. So it's kind of out of the way. And I'm going to pick a green that's going to work for me. I'm going to start by starting with this bluish purple that we had for our mountains. And let's just go ahead and just bring that down into our green tones here. And you can, of course, brighten or darken that as we need. And what we're going to do is once we have that color picked, I'm just going to zoom in just a little bit here. And I'm just going to go ahead and, using my pencil tool, go ahead and just brush in some rough shapes for trees. But when I do that, make sure, of course, that we are first making a new layer, because we don't want this to blend in with some of our other layers here. So we're just going to make a new layer. And let's just go ahead and brush this in. And again, we're just making some rough tree shapes here. It doesn't have to be perfect, because again, these are all just kind of a rough shape. The biggest thing to kind of remember as you're working through this is if you are painting these in, for example, and I accidentally paint over onto this mountain here, because this mountain is kind of overlapping this one, I would need to switch to my eraser tool here and just kind of do some fixing here so those trees kind of remain on this ledge here. But I'm just going to go ahead, finish painting these tops here in with a couple of trees on top. And when we come back, let's see how you did. All right, so I went ahead and just painted in some rough shapes here. And now the trick we are going to do to kind of make these trees look a little bit more believable and kind of not so awkwardly looking is we are, of course, going to just, let's go ahead and zoom this back in here. We're going to bring in our highlight trick that we have done before. So I'm just going to go ahead and move this a little bit more closer to the yellows and bring that up a little bit in tone. And all I'm going to do is bring this down just a little bit in size. And I'm just going to go ahead and to make my trees, the best way to think about this is we can almost just kind of do like these little C shapes here. And so they're almost just like little C's that we have just in here, and they can be upside down, they can be sideways. But the idea is that you're kind of using them to kind of cup in around the mountainside here, and these are going to end up being the highlights here of our little bit of trees that we're going to use to kind of fill the different areas in here. And again, they can kind of be in any direction. They can be upside down, they can be a little sideways, but again, it's just to give us some highlights here for us to work with as we start filling this forest in here. And I'm just going to go ahead and just paint the rest of these in real quick here. And then the next trick that we're going to do is once we have these highlights kind of painted in here, the next trick is going to be to go ahead and bring in this peppering effect that we had done before with this kind of fade out pattern. What that is going to do for us is it's going to go ahead and allow us to just kind of break up this pattern here a little bit so it's not quite so solid and give us just a nice, more natural transition in some of our tree line here. And to do that, I'm just going to bring my brush size back down to 1, and I'm just going to kind of fade that away, just as like how we had done previously. So I'm going to again pause the video, and when we come back, let's go ahead and just see how that peppering effect has kind of worked its way into our work. All right, and so now I've kind of brushed those in. One thing I didn't do here that we had done previously is I didn't create a clipping mask, which could have really helped us with some things, but it's okay. We can go ahead and just create a new clipping mask here now if we want. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a clipping mask, but I want to make sure that I create that layer first. And if we create our clipping mask, there we go. And what I'm going to do with this layer here is I'm going to go ahead and just go ahead and select this into a even lighter tone. So I'm just going to move up here into my shading a little bit. And I'm just going to go ahead and use this to kind of paint along the edge of these borders, just like we had done when we had done our mountain here. And so we're just kind of painting along the edges of these darker regions that we had previously done. And again, that's just to kind of help give us some nice contrast in here. And we, of course, will work in some of these lighter colors here as we move through here, just to kind of help, again, to break this up. So I'm going to pause this real quick, and when we come back, we'll have this all nice and filled in. And you can see that now that everything has been properly applied, we of course have a nice blend of everything here. Now, of course, I could decide that I want to manipulate this further. I could go ahead and use Control U, for example, to go ahead and affect the hue and saturation values a little bit, for example, my original layer, I might say, I'm not really happy with some of those greens. So I can go ahead and blend that a little bit. Maybe I want to make that just a little bit more bluish, for example, or maybe want to increase or decrease some of those saturation values. So again, we can play around with this until we find a value that looks pretty good to us. It's going to blend in nicely with the background, because maybe it's just a little bit too harsh. And so this one's blending pretty nicely here. If I increase the saturation values, of course, too much, it gets to be too bright. So I want to kind of find that nice, happy medium where everything's going to kind of still blend, but still look like it's a part of the natural landscape. All right, and if we zoom that out, we can see we have a nice blending here now of our trees within our mountainside. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is just a couple little housekeeping things here. So I'm going to just zoom this back in. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to, if you remember, we manipulated our hue and saturation, but I might also, I want to maybe change the opacity of some of these highlights, for example. So maybe I don't want that quite so strong with some of those colored variations. And so again, I can play around with this. Now, one thing we do have here is we don't necessarily have a good blend right now between our trees and our grass. And the way we're going to fix that is by merging our two clipping mask layers. And what we're going to do is switch to our eraser tool. And all we are going to do is start erasing in some of those areas beneath the trees. But we also want to keep it so we kind of still have some of that fading out pattern here. And so the best way to do this is kind of move that brush stroke in here and try to get some of those areas out of here so we can get kind of more of that dotted pattern here. Because again, we want this to look a little bit more natural in some of the transition here from the thick tree line at the top of the mountain to some of these thinner lines coming down the sides. And again, we're just going to do this by just going right underneath where this tree line is and just kind of feathering that a little bit so that we have this kind of more natural slope off here where these two pieces come together. And some of these, of course, are going to blend a little differently than others based on however you originally set up your mountainside. But again, it's just to kind of give it a little bit more of that natural transition between the two pieces here. And if I put my foreground back in place, and let's go ahead and just zoom this on out, we can see we have now this nice mountainside with some trees here up on top. And again, if we are still not happy with things, we're always welcome to go back and touch some things up. Like I might say, I want these trees to maybe be a little bit more broken up here along the mountainside. So I'm just going to add just a couple more of these little dots here just to feather it up into the trees. And it's okay if we get gaps here, because remember, the trees themselves might have gaps showing from behind the mountain, because it could just be the light poking through, and there's nothing wrong with that. All right, and once we're satisfied with everything, we can go ahead and call that pretty good. And I think this is a pretty good start for us. And again, if you're not satisfied with anything at any point, you always can go back and make revisions on things to go ahead and just touch everything up. So this is good. This is a great start here. We have now, of course, done our foreground layer. We have a good solid midground layer, and we also have a nice solid background layer. What is going to be the thing that we can do next with this image? Realistically, the last thing that we could do here, besides, of course, adding more detail and stuff like that, is we can animate certain aspects of this image. And that's what we'll look at next time. We'll add in a waterfall, and we'll go ahead and animate that so that way it's just one more layer, one more set of detail that we can have existing within this image.